The 2008 standards for energy efficiency have some new requirements with regards to cool roof technologies for residential buildings. What are cool roof technologies? Well, they're materials that have the ability to have a high solar reflectance, in other words, reflect the energy from the sun, and also materials that have a high emissivity, or the ability to give off their energy. What we'd like to see in a cool roof technology is the ability to reflect a lot of that heat from the sun, but instead of like standard roofing materials where the heat's absorbed, that energy goes into the building. What we want to do is emit that energy back out into the air, not into the building. Well, with me today to explain those changes in the 2008 standards is Mazi Sharak with the California Energy Commission. So what's new about these residential standards? First time ever for cool roofs.
For residential buildings, that's true. The new requirement in 2008 standards are cool roof for both low slope and steep slope buildings. And the requirements vary depending on the climate zones and depending on the type of roofing material that is used. For instance, for roofing products that have a density of less than 5 pounds per square foot, this would be typically asphalt shingles and most metal roofing products. The requirement is a reflectance of 0.20 and emissivity of 0.75.
Let's put that in perspective. Let's take a perfect reflector and a perfect emitter. What would give us some examples?
So a perfect reflector would be a perfect white surface, which is a theoretical surface, that would reflect 100% of the sunlight. That would have a reflectivity of 1. On the other side of the scale, if you have a perfect black surface that absorbs all the radiant heat of the sun, then that would have a reflectivity of 0. So all surfaces would be someplace between 0 and 1. So again, for low density roofing products, shingles and roofing metal roofing products, the reflectivity is 0.20. And the other metric that we use is emissivity, and for almost all requirements, emissivity is 0.75. We also provide an alternative to reflectivity and emissivity. It's a metric we call SRI, or Solar Reflectance Index. And what this does, it allows people to do trade-offs between emissivity and reflectivity. And as long as the total SRI value meets the requirements, it doesn't matter what reflectivity or emissivity is, so long as the SRI meets the prescriptive requirement.
So Mazi, let's clarify this business about emittance a little bit before we move on to solar reflectance.
Emittance is the ability of a product to get rid of the heat that is absorbed. And most natural products have an emittance of 0.75 and more, 0.8, 0.85.
And that means 75% of their energy
right.
can be emitted.
Some products, however, have a low emittance. It's usually metal products. You know, you may have noticed that if you have a shiny tool, you leave it in the sun, it has a higher reflectance, but if you touch it, it's going to burn your hand because that shining surface still has a very low emittance and it gets very hot. But if you touch the surface, the table next to it, is not going to be as hot. So that's an example of a material that's a high emittance versus low emittance.
So with regards to SRI, can you explain the difference between SRI and solar reflectance?
Yes. You know, you can meet the prescriptive requirement by meeting the reflectance and emittance separately, or you can use the SRI, which combines the two in an equation, and you can do trade-offs between reflectance and emittance. And as long as the total SRI, it could have maybe a little bit lower reflectance and a little bit higher emittance, as long as the total SRI meets the SRI requirements of the prescriptive package, then your product complies.
So for low mass materials, those numbers have to be?
For low mass materials, again, that would be asphalt shingles and most metal roofing products. Reflectance is 0.20, emittance is 0.75, or SRI of 10. So you can choose which one you want to use.
Okay, now what about higher, heavier weight materials, say like concrete, tiles?
Right.
Or?
So that's another class of roofing material. And those are the materials that are 5 pounds per square foot or greater, and they're typically tiles. They could be concrete tiles or clay tiles. And the requirement for them is a reflectance of 0.15 an emittance of 0.75 in all 16 climate zones.
And where we could go to find that information is the Cool Roof Rating Council directory?
That is correct. One of the things that the 2008 standards is doing is really trying to encourage people to certify and list their products with the Cool Roof Rating Council. And Cool Roof Rating Council will test your product. They will determine a reflectance and an emittance. And one thing I need to mention, that the reflectance that are used in standards are the 3-year age reflectance values, not initial reflectances. In the standards, in section 118, we provide an equation that allows people who don't have an age reflectance to convert their initial reflectance into an age reflectance. We're hoping in time everybody will have their age reflectance done, and they can list that, get a listing from the Cool Roof Rating Council, and people who are putting in a roofing material, they can go to that website, they get the reflectance and emittance from the Cool Roof Rating Council. If you don't list or certify your product with the Cool Roof Rating Council, you have to use the Energy Commission's default values for reflectance that are very punitive, and you don't want to do that.
Okay. What about the slope of roofs that fall under these categories?
We have two types of roofs. One is called the steep slope, and steep slope are those roofs that have a run-to-rise ratio of greater than 2/12, and the low slope are kind of like the flat roofs, and they have a rise-to-run less than 2/12. It's about 9.5 degrees from the horizon.
Is there a difference in the numbers for those two types
The
of
requirements are different. For the low-rise, the requirement is in only climate zones 13 and 15, which are the hottest climate zones. They must have a reflectance, age reflectance of 0.55 and emittance of 0.75.
And 2 and 12 and greater, or what we discussed earlier?
That's what we discussed earlier, that they have to have an age solar reflectance of 0.20 for asphalt shingles and metal products, and an age reflectance of 0.15 for tiles.
Or an SRI of 10.
Or SRI of 10 for the asphalt shingle products.
Right. Mazi, what's interesting is that when people think about roof technologies like Cool Roof Technologies, you think of them being very light colors, but half the energy from the sun comes in daylight, and about the other half, the heat from the sun, comes in the infrared, and some of these new pigments can actually be dark and still reflect a lot of the sun's heat, right?
You're right, Steve, because the energy of the sun comes in visible light, infrared, and ultraviolet, and they all contribute to the heating of the space. So you can have a product that would reflect more of the infrared and ultraviolet and less of the visible, and it still meets the Cool Roof requirements of the standards. So what this does, it gives the customers a choice of pigments. So you don't have to have a pale white roof. You can actually have a very nice, colorful roof and still meet the Cool Roof requirement of the standards.
So Mazi, photovoltaics or PV systems are becoming more and more popular in roof systems. You have integrated and you have the rack type. How does the standards react to that, and how do we know what to do where?
Well, that's a very good question, Steve, because we at the Energy Commission and the governor, the legislature, the utilities, we're all providing incentives for more and more photovoltaics. So the requirements are basically for PV systems that are on a rack or they're elevated or they're just sitting on top of the roof. Then the roof must still meet the Cool Roof requirements. And the reason for that is that these PV systems can be removed from the roof at some future date. However, if the PV is integrated into the roof itself, is part of the shingles or the tiles, then those areas of the roof that has the integrated PV system are exempt from the Cool Roof requirement, but all the other areas of the roof must still meet the Cool Roof requirements of the standards.
Well, Mazi, this is a great lesson on cool roofs. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.